My conversation today is with scholar, professor, host of the ESOTERICA channel, and returning guest, Dr. Justin Sledge. Fresh off of his latest venture, an immersive educational tour through Egypt, Dr. Sledge and I sit down to discuss his travels through some of the oldest, most significant, and enigmatic archaeological sites in world history. I was fascinated to discover what he taught and what he learned. For more on Dr. Sledge's experiences in Egypt, be sure to watch the videos he has posted on the ESOTERICA channel. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanum Podcast.
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited that we're going to talk about your recent excursion to Egypt.
Yeah, Ike, thank you for having me back on. It's always a real honor to be on the podcast. I appreciate it, and yeah, excited to talk about the Egypt trip, and also excited to loop back around when you finished yours and compare notes.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, you know, I've been to Egypt a couple of times, and like you kind of mentioned, or as you just mentioned, I'll be doing a trip also with the same company in October. And, it's a big thing, I think, to take on something like this. It's really intense. So what was your inspiration behind the trip? When in the planning stages, what did you want to accomplish, and what made you really think, like, you know what, I think I can do this?
Well, I think that what made me think I can do this is probably just being crazy. I don't think that's a rational thought to think, and fortune favors the bold, as they say. I think what inspired me to do it is I've been wanting to take Esoterica as a platform or as an educational platform, get it out of YouTube and get it on the ground somewhere. Because I just feel like you can't really do a ton of deep learning on YouTube. I just don't think it's possible. I think that the classroom has its strengths and weaknesses. YouTube has its strengths and weaknesses. Podcasts have strengths and weaknesses. There's lots of different strengths and weaknesses when it comes to educational venues. But one of the venues I was and remain very excited about is what I would refer to as in situ learning, where you learn about the concepts, you learn about the ideas, you learn about the history in the place in which it happened. Because I think there's something about you look around and the history is just literally all around you. The dust is on your boots. The sand is in your eyes. The sun is tanning your flesh, and it's inescapable. You can't check out. The history is just right there. And so there's something about reading, I don't know, the Corpus Hermeticum in a Detroit classroom, which is where I am. And there's just nothing about Detroit and nothing about a classroom really that has anything to do with the Corpus Hermeticum. There's another thing to do when you get out there and you're on a mountain overlooking, the high priest of Thoth's tomb. And you're there in the midst of Hermopolis Magna. And so that's just a whole different ballgame. So it's been a long-standing goal of mine to take Esoterica out of YouTube and put it on the ground somewhere, and then to put it on the ground where the thing happened. And of course, in many ways, Western esotericism is born in Egypt. Almost all the major thinkers emerge out of Egypt. All the major schools of thought emerge out of Egypt. Everything from the Greek magical papyri to the Kabbalah. People forget Luria. It's like Luria. He forged what we now know as Lurianic Kabbalah, not in Sfat. He died in Sfat. He was only there for a few years, but he forged it on the banks of the Nile. And these self-imposed exiles he would go on. And so everything from that literature, Plotinus is born there, Ammonius Saccas is born there. I mean, how many philosophers can you name that have of Alexandria on the tail end of their name, So this is just a place where Western esotericism is born in many ways. And so it was a natural fit to take esoterica to Egypt and to do that work there as a first exercise in what I would call this in situ learning.
And so, how did you prepare for it. I mean, you had an extensive itinerary. I believe you did two consecutive tours, correct? Like two
That's
different
true.
groups. So what was the preparation process like? Because that is really fascinating to me.
So the preparation process was sort of two things, one of which was the logistics side, and that was all covered by Argos, who I will say did a fantastic job. It was just seamless. It was fantastic to work with Aubrey, who was the CEO of Argos. I really had just a great time with her, and things worked out really, really well for all the hard work they did, and they should be highly applauded for the work they did. On my side, it was mostly taking texts and then taking those texts and thinking about where might they have been written, what kind of milieu would have produced them, what kind of sites um, bring out what's important about these texts. And sometimes it's a little vague, like the Greek magical papyri. Like, where exactly were those written? We don't really know. We don't even know where they were found. Thebes, maybe. It seems like they were probably found in graves in Thebes, but we don't really know exactly where they were composed. And it probably is the case they were composed all over, and then, they end up in the grave of one of these ritual practitioners. So it was taking text, everything was anchored in text, and then taking text and applying it to place. And so it was text, place, text, place, text, place. And in some ways, it was really easy. In some ways, it was a bit more challenging. We couldn't get down to Panopolis, Akhmim, where Zosimus was. But, look, you're down in Middle Egypt. You're close enough to be able to talk about sort of the birth of alchemy and that kind of setting. So it was a conversation between text and place. And so one of the things that the tour had was a reader, and everyone got a copy of the reader, and the reader was, I think, 333 pages long. Just that wasn't on purpose, but it was a chunky little book, and it had everything in it from the Apocryphon of John to the Corpus Medicum to alchemical texts. It had some section from the Conversations of the House of Life, the Book of Thoth, um, all the way up to Lurianic Kabbalah. So it really was a who's who of pretty important esoteric texts. Plotinus, Iamblichus is in there. And again, what's the connection of Iamblichus? Well, Iamblichus claimed to have learned all this stuff from priests there in Egypt. So he himself, of course, was Syrian. But that was the kind of dialogue, place and text, and then putting people in the place, getting them to read the text, lecturing on the texts, and getting people to synthesize those. I think the most powerful example of that was we got to do an exclusive access trip to the pyramid of Unas, and we were there for 2 hours. And basically, we worked through the pyramid, the first pyramid text, the earliest pyramid text, the text of Unas. And it's one thing to read the oldest religious text in the world. It's another thing to be sitting inside of it. With the hieroglyphics are all around you. You are the tiny thing. The book is holding you. You are not holding the book anymore. And working through the logic of why this text is on that lintel and on this wall, and how Unas's Ka and Ba are combined into an Ach, and then transformed in the Achtet, and then ejected out of the Achtet into the morning dawn, and then to actually go out into the morning dawn at Saqqara, right at the same moment that Unas's Ach would have ascended out of the pyramid. Yeah, it's very powerful. You can be a spiritually, I think a person. For me, I'm not a terribly spiritual person, but even just the aesthetics of that, the historical and religious significance of that was very powerful. So that was a kind of guiding light that drove me and informed me of how I was designing the trip.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way to dovetail, your particular expertise on the subject and that immersive quality with the logistical, you know, uh, sort of arrangements of being there at that time, being able to sort of have that private access and walk out, time it perfectly. Yeah, I would see even like, the most hardened skeptic being touched on a very human level by
Mhm.
something like that. So that seems like a very beautiful touch. So had you been to Egypt before? Was this your first time? What were your thoughts if this wasn't your first time? What were your thoughts this time around?
So it wasn't my first time. I'd been to Egypt about 15 years prior. I actually went when I was studying in Amsterdam at the HHP, the Center for Hermetic Philosophy there. I was getting my degree, and the Dutch winter had just got to me. I was just done with the Dutch winter. And so I literally just took the first flight out, and my girlfriend and then I at the time just went to Luxor, just like get out of here. Go where I think it was a debate between Marrakesh and Luxor, and we went to Luxor, and ultimately we made our way up to Cairo. We took the night bus, which I would recommend no one in their right mind ever do. It's an all-night bus ride, but it was the cheapest way. It was very inexpensive, but I would never recommend anyone do that. So I think that, and we were very poor. I mean, we're graduate students. You're talking about poverty budgets. I didn't have the money to go inside the Great Pyramid. We had to be really picky about what we did and didn't do. I think the big difference between this time and then is that unfortunately the Egyptian pound's completely collapsed. So everything is shockingly inexpensive for tourists, and that allowed me to do things that were beyond my wildest imagination. Going down into the Osiris shaft, for instance, being able to make a trip where we actually get down into the Osiris shaft. It's been 2 hours down there.
Yeah.
So it was the thing that was the biggest difference was, there was kind of I had two minds about planning the trip. One of the minds was make it as accessible as possible by making it as affordable as possible by doing the least amount of private access stuff possible. And the other side of it was, no, let's make this a pretty luxury trip, really doing a lot of private access stuff, which is frankly going to be pretty expensive. And I decided, you know what? Let's just go all in and see if we can really do something that will, really be impactful. We did go to Luxor. We stayed in mostly Lower Egypt and Middle Egypt, but no, crawling down. Yeah, I was tour leader, so I was always sort of first in, last out. But we got down into the Osiris shaft, and the only way to see the sarcophagus is by someone holding a light at a certain angle, so that you can see past the muck. And the only way to do that is for someone to be standing in the water. The water table is pretty high down there, and that water is not nice. But I remember being like, you know what? You got to be the guy. You're the leader. Like, come off that ladder, get in the muck, hold the light. And so I held the light so that everyone could come down the ladder, get a glimpse of the sarcophagus of Osiris. So it was things like that, just I remember when the last person went up and I was down there by myself, they're like, Herodotus saw this. I'm in the same room that Herodotus stood in, and I'm down here by myself. And it was just the most, again, you can be, like you said, a hardened skeptic. And when you realize you're 30 meters inside of the Giza Plateau and above you are the pyramids and the Sphinx and a lot of it, and you're down here in this weird room, there's no way it doesn't take on a kind of dreamlike, numinous, you're in the belly of the Giza Plateau. It's bizarre and
Yeah, like
weird.
surreal.
Surreal. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I don't think, I don't think anyone could avoid that sensation. And it's a wonderful sensation to find yourself wrapped with the strangeness and the uncanniness of a place. I definitely embrace that feeling. That's a fantastic feeling. I feel like we could use a lot more of that kind of experience of the numinous.
Yeah. And what's interesting when I was there, that was kind of what characterized my introduction to Egypt was this sense of this very strange, dreamlike quality to the place where it almost felt like I was in some sort of I don't know, Jim Jarmusch or Alejandro Jodorowsky film where things like barely made sense. And because there's Egyptian architecture is it's you drive around the Northeast or in the South, and there's that kind of like, Greek revival architecture. It's very Roman inspired, particularly in the capital in DC. And so you go to Greece, you go to Rome, wherever, and you see, it's kind of all right. Yeah, I know this looks familiar. It's magnificent, it's impressive, but it's familiar. And then you go to Egypt, you go to a place like, Dendara or even, Karnak, and the the pylons are shaped like flowers, you know, and it's like there's something trippy about it. It's like an acid trip
Yeah.
almost, you know.
Or just the constant gods everywhere. They're like these sort of very, humanoid beings with baboon heads and dog heads, and yeah, it's, yeah, it is like you said, it is jarring, it is dreamlike, like it's familiar and very foreign.
Yeah. So some of the highlights of the trip for you, I've heard you talk a bit about the tomb of Petosiris. Without being, I guess, maybe like, I don't know, too without belaboring it, could you maybe for some of the listeners who might not know exactly who that is, could you explain a little bit about the background of Petosiris and why Petosiris is important?
So yeah, so Petosiris was a 4th century BCE high priest of Thoth. In fact, his father and elder brother, who were all buried in that same tomb, were all we know 5 generations of his family from the inscriptions in that tomb. And so he lived in an interesting time. He lived during the very end of the Persian rule of Egypt, but also right at the beginning of the Greek rule. And what's interesting as a high priest of Thoth is that, we have this story about how Hermeticism came into existence, which is to say, these are Egyptian priests using Greek language and Greek ideas to express some Egyptian mode of salvation. And what's fascinating about the tomb of Petosiris, and I'll be doing an episode about this next week actually, is that we see that Greco-Egyptian combination. If you go to his tomb is built like a temple. It's not built like normal tombs. It looks much more like a Greek temple in some ways from the outside. It has this pronaos, and the interior looks very classically Egyptian. But the outside of the tomb, the sort of inner courtyard of the tomb, is covered in Greek style art. And this is hundreds of miles inland. This is not Alexandria. This is like deep in Middle Egypt. And it's just like, and also, we have inside of it on the columns, the hieroglyphics are basically Petosiris, his father, and his older brother talking to the viewer, saying, welcome, you who come to this desert, who've come to this tomb. Just know that my soul is nearby, and by saying my name, you keep me alive, and that you should know that the way to maintain your own life is by being reverence to the God and being on the way of Thoth. It's that phraseology, and the fact that you're sort of caught into a dialogue where a high priest of Thoth is telling a non-Egyptian, me, right, how to be on the way of Thoth via reverence to the God. It's in the singular. It just sounds like Hermeticism to me. And I would argue, and I'm going to argue this, and it's going to be controversial, whatever. But I think that the Tomb of Petosiris might be the earliest Hermetic text we have.
Really?
I
Wow.
think it ticks all the boxes. There's Greek influence there. It's Thoth, right? You even
Uh-huh.
see he's twice great, Thoth, in Petosiris' tomb. He's not thrice great, twice great.
Really?
Um, and you see the Greek influence. You see all of that, and there's something about the way that it comes across. The importance of reverence, eusebia is a way we put in Greek, and even the way of Thoth. That language is that's the way that the Corpus Hermeticum talks.
Mhm.
And in addition to that, Petosiris, the tomb became a pilgrimage place after he died, and we have Greek graffiti saying, may the spirit of Petosiris who is here bless me. So Greeks and Romans, in fact, just around the corner, as you know, there's a Roman burial there. So this is a place where we think about Hermeticism as the Greek encapsulation of Egyptian wisdom. This is where it would happen. You can see it literally, the writings on the wall. And so, and of course, also Petosiris goes on to be associated with astrological lore. There are over 100 fragments where Petosiris is teaching astrological lore, magical lore, and to some degree alchemical lore. And those are the big Hermetic sciences, right? It's just, now, did he write those? I don't know that he did, right? But it doesn't really matter. What matters is the people that wrote them thought to associate them with Petosiris.
Mm,
That's what matters. In
right.
their mind, he was connected to it. And again, there's always a dot, dot, dot. We're not sure exactly the connection. But I'm going to make an argument this week that I do think that the Tomb of Petosiris is our earliest text that is recognizably hermetic in some sense.
Mm.
And I do think that we need to add Petosiris into the list of quasi-legendary people. And again, this is third century BCE, right?
Mm.
Corpus Medicum, they think, right? Second, third century CE. This
Okay.
is 500 years prior. And so middle of fourth century BCE. So I'm going to make an argument that that we need to rethink. We need to think about a different timeline for Hermeticism. I think it's a little earlier than what we typically think of it as, maybe a good bit earlier. But yeah, it made a huge impact on me. I mean, so much so that as soon as I visited the tomb, as soon as I got back to Alexandria, I immediately went on archive.org and read the 3 volume. I had 2 days off in between the two tours. On my 2 days off, I spent those 2 days reading in French the 3 volume analysis of the tomb written in 1923-24. That's what I
Wow.
spent. This thing's like huge. It's like 3 volume. I spent just several hours a day, and my French is not great, but it got a lot better. But just reading, just like slamming into this text from the 20s when it was first written.
Mm.
So I've been really fascinated by this tomb. Pretty fascinated by Petosiris as a character, and I think he's an important slept on character in the history of Hermeticism that I don't think has really gotten a lot of play. And you do see him mentioned in footnotes mostly. He's footnotes in
Yeah.
Christian Bull's book. He's footnotes in some other books, but I think he needs to be a lot more than a footnote.
Mm. Well, that's actually really exciting. I'm looking forward to that episode. Um, I think we mentioned something a little earlier. I think we were off camera talking about how that region in general is kind of, slept on.
Mhm.
That Middle Egypt sort of thing, Hermopolis Magna, um, and juxtaposing that in particular against something, I guess, of possessing universal renown, like something like the pyramids and the Sphinx at the Giza Plateau. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that because I think you've got some interesting things to say, in particular about the pyramids and
Yeah, I have, it's impossible for me not to have sort of two minds about the pyramids. And the longer I was on the Giza Plateau, the one mind became the bigger mind. So there's two minds. The first mind, of course, is that these are obviously incredibly impressive structures that have been impressive for 4,000 plus years, and that there's no way to marvel. There's no way not to marvel at them. I don't care who you are. You look at these things and they're just absolutely marvelous. Um, you know, awe-inspiring. And yet, the longer I was there and the more that I read about, ancient Egyptian history, ancient Egyptian society, you read about how they were constructed, the levee and mass system in which, basically during the flood season, you have all these workers brought in, not slaves, workers, they were paid, to build the pyramids. And there is a strange emphasis that I noticed. I think that comes mostly out of sort of the New Age movement, the New Thought movement, the New Age movement. Edgar Cayce and a lot of these guys who really put a huge spiritual influence on the pyramids. For them, the pyramids become these spiritual objects. And again, I'm not talking about people who think that they're spaceships or power systems or whatever, but that too, I think that's part of it, right? And there's a part of me that is also like when I was inside there thinking to myself, this is just a ancient dictator's tribute to their own narcissistic desire not to die. And then basically compelling the population of a country to build this for them and paying them, sure. But I mean, imagine if Barack Obama or Donald Trump took all the unemployed people in this country and paid them, minimum wage to build them giant pyramids so they wouldn't die. It would, Elon Musk's giant pyramid, you know, whatever
uh,
Mussolini's giant pyramid or whatever. I just these are ancient dictators, kings, right? That's you become king either because you rise up the Game of Thrones, murdering your opponents, or you just happen to slide out of the right vagina, and no part of any of that is just or good or you know, and so there's a very American impulse in me, right? This is like the I don't know, the Republican in me, little R Republican, sort of the
Right.
Tom Paine saying like, why should we find any spiritual significance in the forced labor built tomb of ancient dictators? And so, it sort of cuts in two ways for me. And again, I don't want to diminish anyone for whom the pyramids are of spiritual value, and they do find some sense of spiritual elevation by either being inside them or contemplating them. But from a historical point of view, I don't know. Like I said, I have this very sort of American kind of, um, you know, uh, like I said, little R Republican kind of look down my nose. How dare these kings think that they should do this? So I don't know. I have, like I said, two minds about it. It's one thing to think of them as marvels, and certainly they are. It's another thing to think of them as, like I said, sort of the narcissistic passion projects of ancient dictators.
Yeah, and so especially for people, I think like us and people who are most likely listening to this podcast, where we have a connection to or a very, very deep, profound interest and involvement in the study of Western esotericism, we're able to sort of reprioritize and reorient. I think to a lot of people, the pyramids, the Sphinx, that's just already in their heads. It's
Hmm.
automatic association, but not a lot of people know about, Nichepso and Petosiris
Right.
and Zosimus of Panopolis and stuff. So yeah, that sort of reprioritization. And I think that's really interesting because, personally, I think some of the work that you're doing there could contribute to, in some small way, can over time, really contribute to, seeing Egypt as this more, just going deeper and really peeling back the layers of its profound and rich, philosophical history as well. I think that, the time is ripe for that. So, I mean, is this something that you think that you would continue to do? Is this gonna be something that, you talked about in the beginning of our conversation? I mean, is this the new way forward for esoterica?
Well, I certainly hope that I can do it more. I mean, and to your point, right? And even when we were there in the Giza Plateau, I made the point to go to Area A. No one goes to Area A. Area A is where the workers are buried that built the things. And it's one thing yes, it's quite a thing to stare into the skull, right? There's physical human remains there, where you're like literally looking into the skull of a guy you can still see the compression of his spine from the work they were doing. It was not easy work. Repetitive, difficult, painful work, and you can see it in the bones of the guys that built it. That's why I also find the ancient alien stuff so repugnant. It just erases actual Egyptian history. And my dad was a pipe fitter. He's a working class guy, and I know the physical pain he suffers from having been a pipe fitter in Mississippi. And I look at their bones, and I see my dad's bones, and I'm like, no, these guys worked their ass off to build these pyramids. How dare you claim someone else did it? It spits in the face of history. And so yeah, that was an important thing to get over to Area A, which I would encourage anyone to get over there if they can. But yeah, I think that really focusing from the point of view of an interest in esotericism, I think we need to get away from the more conspiracy, ancient alien stuff of Sphinx and Atlantis and the Akashic records being underneath it and all that. That's neat, I guess, in some ways. But if we're really going to be serious about the history, about what we know, we need to get into the priesthood. We need to get into how the priesthood was structured, what literature we have from the priests, which we do have literature. We need to be reading, there's a lot of literature we need to be reading. And we need to get into that stuff. And I think that that's the Egyptian history that's actually connected to Western esotericism. The pharaohs wouldn't have given a damn about it's just not their bag. I mean, Ramses II has to like fight off the sea people and deal with peace treaties with the Hittites. He's not muck about with as much as he had to, I suppose. But I mean, this is not where esotericism is not born from the pharaohs. It's
Right.
born from the priesthood, and we need to be serious about understanding that literature. We have some of that literature. and really getting into it and studying it and appreciating it as the ground floor. And again, there's no shade to be thrown at the pyramid. Again, I would never tell someone, and it'd be ridiculous and arrogant to tell someone who's never been to Egypt, oh yeah, you can skip the pyramids. That's just crazy, right?
Yeah.
But what is important is to say, let's put if you're here for esotericism, let's put them into the context and say, look, you're going to do that because that's like a bucket list item, and that's cool, and that's fine. That's great, but they're not really connected to the history and development of esotericism. Not really, right? Or only in sort of a ahistorical 20th century kind of sense. Uh, and again, it's more vibes than history.
Yeah, and I mean, like you go in there and there's, the Great Pyramid, and there's not even any hieroglyphics on the wall. There's nothing in there. It's just
Nothing in there.
you climb up this shaft, and with like tons of other people, and then you get the Great Chamber, the King's Chamber. It's really humid, and there's just a gigantic box in it. It's
Yeah.
really.
It's rose granite in a box. I mean, I would tell people, look, if you're gonna go inside a pyramid, the Pyramid of Unas, go in there. I mean, Pyramid of Unas is, we had to spend 2 hours in there, and that's the first appearance of the soul in literature. That's the first time the soul is mentioned, really. It's the first time the afterlife is mentioned, really. It's the first time that there's an idea that you can survive your death. It's the first descriptions we get of the afterlife in, like, period, just full stop.
Wow.
First, some of the earliest depictions, some of the earliest mentions of magic, of Heka that we get in world literature. And every single wall of that pyramid is covered in hieroglyphs. And so I would tell people, if you want to go into a pyramid, the Pyramid of Unas is, without any doubt in my mind, the most impressive, most impressive structure, not because of what the structure is, but because of what is inside of it. And that is to say, it's one thing for you to hold a book. It's another thing for you to be inside the book. The book is holding you. And the first appearance, I think about some comic books, right? First appearance of Batman or first appearance of Wolverine. This is like the first appearance of the soul, first appearance of the afterlife, first appearance of, and that's inside the Pyramid of Unas. And I think that's far more impressive, far more important for the history of religion, for the history of spirituality, for the history of esotericism. That's literally the ground floor for ideas that are utterly unimaginable we couldn't imagine our world without those ideas. And they really show up in a substantial way for the first time on the walls of the Pyramid of Unas.
Yeah. Well, I bet a lot of people are just green with envy right now for everybody that got to go with you. You guys went to Alexandria too, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And so what would you guys end up doing there? I'd been to the Serapeum there, and it was pretty cool. I'm assuming you guys popped over there.
Yep. Yeah, so we went to the new Library of Alexandria, which was nice. They have a really great manuscript collection. It is really weird to see the copy of the Shams Ma'arif, perhaps the most notorious of all Arabic grimoires, in the Library of Alexandria. I'd never expected to say, hey, there's a copy of the Shams Ma'arif in the Library of Alexandria. Just like my brain kind of like, it just, but it was cool to see, sort of like, it was cool to know that the folks at the library took the time to take they did a whole display case of just books of the occult sciences. And I was like, good for them. They didn't have to do that. That was a decision they made. Good on them for highlighting this important part of history that so often just gets overlooked. So we did the Library of Alexandria. We went over to where the Pharos was, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which is now the big citadel. So we saw that. Of course, we went to the Serapeum. Of course, Serapeum's crucially important in the history of all this stuff. One of the places we also went that I think also gets slept on is we went to the Roman settlement, the Roman ruins, the remains of the old Roman bath, and they have a little theater there. But what people don't realize is that next to the baths, if you're sort of looking down that avenue to the baths, are lecture halls. This is where people would have rented out lecture halls and given talks. And if you look at the map of where that is in the city, and you look at kind of the remains of what we know ancient Alexandria to have been, that is really the only place in Roman era Alexandria where you'd have gotten the kind of public discourse that we think of when we think about all these philosophers and all these theologians and all these mystics that were operating in Alexandria. They were all in there. And it's something to be, as an educator myself, to be staring out to the ruins of the rooms in which Ammonius Saccas taught, or Origen, or any of these guys that would have been there in Alexandria. The Hermeticists were probably lecturing in there. This is the areas where they would have gathered their students, and they would have had they would have had their lectures. And there's something about, again, as speaking as an educator, you know, staring into the classrooms and trying to hear the voices of all those people that I've read, and knowing that I'm walking on the same streets they walked on. That it humbles me, but also inspires me to say, I can put my voice in that conversation, and I want to do that in the most respectful and impactful way, and to know that my voice was bouncing off the walls that perhaps Plotinus's voice bounced off of was deeply humbling, deeply touching, and inspires me to say, I'm gonna do the best I can, because if my voice is going to enter into that chorus, then I need to make sure I'm doing my damnedest to honor them by by being the best educator I can be.
Yeah. I mean, that's beautiful. I mean, and also I think something like that for anybody that is interested in history would be powerful, but I think it's a little different for us that grew up and live in the States, because we don't have the same, connection to our history per se, and it doesn't go as far back in
Right.
terms of, what we would consider the elements of modern, quote unquote Western civilization here. It's we just don't have it. It's like it's almost unfathomable to me that some places have thousands of years of like continuous history and some of it, is lying in ruins right there. You can go touch it.
Yeah, yeah, and ruins are also a testimony, right? One of the things that we talked about was the Library of Alexandria, and people were like, "Are we going to visit the library?" I'm like, "We don't know where it was.
Yeah.
We don't even know where it was. Nothing's ever been recovered from there." And they're like, "Oh yeah, it got burned down." I'm like, "It did get burned. It got caught on fire a couple times, but that's not why it was gone. It was gone because the Library of Alexandria began as a flex by the Ptolemies on their rivals. It was a political project of Hellenization. It wasn't actually there ultimately for the intellectual and spiritual edification of people. It was there because the Ptolemies wanted to have a big library, so they could have the biggest, so they could like flex on Pergamum and Athens and Ephesus. And when that no longer became important, the library just got it was destroyed through apathy, through political apathy, more than fire and more than war. And I think that, our inability to visit the Library of Alexandria is all the more reasons why you should be donating and supporting your local library, because it was apathy that destroyed the Library of Alexandria. And that's why we can't. It's political apathy. And that's why we can't visit it. Not because Caesar burned it down. And so the cataclysm wasn't a one and done accidental fire by a tyrant. It was
Right.
just negligence. It was intellectual and spiritual negligence on the part of the powers that be. And I think that if we can take one lesson from our inability to visit the Library of Alexandria, it's support your educational institutions, because they don't exist on their own. They exist because the public will needs them, and makes sure that they exist. And if we don't do that, then um, our universities will also be places that become ruins.
Mm. Yeah, and another thing about Egypt too, and I'm wondering how much of the trip you kind of devoted to examining this, but what was really fascinating was seeing the strata almost of religious practice happening kind of like some early Christians, I think the Copts, the Coptic Christians would use the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut as a place to worship at night under the cover of darkness, and of course Islam being the prevalent religion there at the current time. Although I think the Copts are still the largest minority population there. Um, and just things for so long, that religious tolerance, specifically in Egypt, really having historical vestiges, things that you can go and see. Did you guys talk about any of the Coptic stuff or the early Christianity that was there?
Yeah, we definitely did. We had some sort of Gnosticism stuff in the reader, along with some of the Greek fathers, or the Desert Fathers rather.
Mm.
So they were also in our reader. We visited the monastery there, one of the major monasteries of Saint Mary of the Syrians. So we visited that monastery. And yeah, so we talked to a good bit of this. Also, we were like decoding. I read some Sahidic Coptic, so we would be in one of the cliff tombs of Beni Hassan, and they had written the names of saints over the faces of what they thought were gods. Of course, they were just local administrators, and so you'll see this like Peter, James, Paul, whatever, just written over the faces of these guys as a way of like facing their what they thought to be their power with the power of saints and apostles and things. So it's kind of a religious conversation, or religious shade being thrown through time. So it's kind of fun, to be, looking at it and deciphering some of these texts. So yeah, we definitely talked about some of the early Coptic stuff and the rise of early Christianity. And it's just a lesson in Egypt, that you're never looking at one thing. Often someone's like, well, what is this tomb? When does it date to? I'm like, well, it depends on who's in it. Again, I'll give the example of the tomb of Petosiris I just mentioned, is that at the end of the Roman period, people just started piling sarcophagi inside of the tomb of Petosiris, and they just reused it as a random place to put other dead people. And so it was no longer his tomb; it just became the local place to put dead people. Um, so yeah, it's important to note that folks may know this idea of a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a manuscript where part of it has been erased and written over, and you can almost always see what's been erased. Sometimes it's not easy to see it, but you can, with special lights, various kind of imaging, you can bring out the erased text. And no place as old as Egypt, or Rome, or Greece, or ancient China, or whatever. Every place is going to be erased and written over, erased and written over. And so, at no point in Egyptian history are you looking at one thing. The famous examples, you look at the Great Pyramids. You're not looking at the Great Pyramids. The Great Pyramids, as you see them, were never meant to be looking like that, because all the casing stones are gone. The casing stones are all in big mosques, in Cairo, and so you're looking at the pyramids naked, in a way that would have horrified their architects. And you only see at the very top of Khafre's pyramid the remains of the casing stones up there. And so even when you look at the pyramid, you're not looking at one thing. You're looking at two things. You're looking at an old kingdom construction bereft of the casing stones that are now probably somewhere in the palace of Suleiman or whatever. So yeah, this is a thing that to keep in mind, is that history is mobile, it's dynamic, and what you see is actually several things, always many things at once. Um, and so yeah, you can sometimes see this when you see and you will see it. You'll see like clearly random hieroglyphs on the wall of a mosque, and you're like, they just reuse that stone. Or you
Crazy.
see this in churches where there'll be just random. You can barely see the effaced some impression of some cartouche or something, and you're just like, that was never actually meant to be a church. It was clearly they just took stones from wherever they could. Because again, I mean, as a working class guy, I mean, if I went to a work site and I needed something and it was already there was already a cut stone there, there's no way I'm cutting stones. I'm like, let those schmucks do it. Like, just reuse what they did. I think it's, so clearly, this is the kind of thing So yeah, it's Egypt is a place, like I think many ancient places, where you're seeing several things at once, and being able to tease out those layers is very important, because if you can't tease those layers out, you make a lot of historical errors about why these buildings are where they are, or what their function was, or how many functions they end up having through time, things like this.
Mm. Well, and that's the kind of stuff that's really what I appreciate the most about what you bring to the conversation in esotericism is because, I'll say it so other people don't have to, um, esotericism hasn't really been known for that level of, I would say, nuance and historical rigor. And what it's done is it's kind of until very recently, it's sort of exactly to your point. It's created this environment where everything is it's taken us a really long time to really get the context of what is going on, and certain things appear to be just like random religious syncretism, which to some degree is apparent in certain texts like the PGM, etc. But there's much more nuance here, and I really appreciate that throughout your um the voice that you have contributed to the study of this stuff has been sort of a voice of reason, and a voice that is now trying to, I mean, when you really think about it, esotericists without the um uh you know I would say educational or academic background, as many people such as yourself and Dan Trell and Dr. Puka and Walter Hanegraaff, they now have to reevaluate what they're doing and what their contributions are. And I think that I think that that's super, super, super important. And you do bring a level of historical nuance that is brilliant. I can appreciate that very much, especially having been to the place that you're. I mean, I'm learning things right now from you. So,
I appreciate that. And again, I don't want to do that. And sometimes people take it that if you historicize someone's beliefs and you delegitimate them, right? That if you show, yeah, it wasn't when people showed when Calzabon showed that the Corpus Hermeticum didn't go back, 5,000 years or whatever. Some people took that as, well, now because the Corpus Hermeticum is not going back to the time of Moses, it's of no value. That's simply not true. The truth of the matter is that historical texts have value in what they say, not in how old they are. It doesn't really matter that Hermes Trismegistus was legendary. If there are spiritual truths for people inside these texts, or spiritual truths to be found in this literature, or philosophically interesting things, or historically interesting, there's no amount of showing their history that should be able to have an impact on that. So I would encourage people to say that if your spirituality requires you to make up history to justify it, is that a good spirituality, right? If you have to believe a lot of like kind of wink, wink, you look at it hard, look at it sideways and squint your eyes, and maybe you can connect the dots to the Knights Templar or whatever. I'm like, you just don't have to do that. If you pick up a text and it's spiritually important for you, valuable, Hermes Trismegistus doesn't have to be an actual Egyptian sage that taught Moses, 3,000 years ago, whatever. That just doesn't have to be the case. So no, I think that the more history we get, the more tools and techniques and depth we get to this information. And I don't think any spirituality is harmed by more depth, by more nuance, by more context. I do think what they're harmed by is, let's think of them as timeless, ahistorical things that if one piece of evidence is shown that can undo them, now they're undone. That's a really dangerous. That's a spirituality built on a very, very shaky foundation. That if you excavate under the Sphinx and you don't find the Akashic record, now your spirituality's done. I don't want to. I wouldn't want to put my eggs in that basket. That's just not the way I think it's wise to go about this. I think we should say, look, this is myth history, and myth is important because it tells us truths.
right.
It doesn't have to be ground in historical facts to still tell us important truths. And I think for any philosophically minded person, spiritually minded person, it's those truths, which are the unique purview of myth in some ways, which I think are important. It's just very important we don't take our myths literally. I often see this happening with many folks in the esoteric world who come out of the fundamentalist Christian world, where they took a bunch of myths literally in the Christian world, and now they have to take them literally in the esoteric world. And I'm like, I don't. You just sort of exchanged your fundamentalisms. I don't. I don't think that either one of those approaches to uh, meaning making via truth encoded in myth is an especially productive way of going about it.
Mm. So, from your in your preparation and your research, and we all know that you remain fairly engaged consistently, because your output on the channel is very high volume. But in this particular session, researching, going there, discussing, did you learn anything new, or was there anything that really kind of maybe subverted any preconceptions that you might have had before the trip or the excursion?
I think one of the things is, sort of the around Hermeticism, particularly, going into this tomb of Petosiris and learning about this literature associated with him. There's this pendulation that's happened with Hermeticism that the earlier school said this is bad Greek philosophy in Egyptian window dressing, and that was my position for a long time. And this is just sort of cooked over Numenius with Egyptian, wigs on or something. I was sort of it was a relatively low opinion of this material, and that was honestly my opinion for a long time. And then Christian Bull and other people about chronograph have come along and said, no, we need to really, really, really rethink this. Garth Fowden and other folks, and I've shown that no, there's a lot more context here in the Egyptian situation. It's just because we've had this bias basically against learning anything actual about Egypt, that we need to really learn about Egyptian history and Egyptian culture and the culture around the priesthood in order to appreciate this. And so that has pendulated in the other direction. Right now, it's like mostly Egyptian with just encoded in Greek language. And I can't say that I've pendulated as hard in the direction of folks like Christian Bull. But I will say that I think that it's much clearer to me the Egyptian influence is very real. That feels a lot more real to me now. And that I think it's a lot older than I think we think it is. I think that the experimentations of Graeco-Egyptian or Egyptian Greek dialogue or spiritual cross-pollination, we might call it, that ultimately resulted in what we call Hermeticism. I think that process was actually going on a good bit earlier than we think. And I think the tomb of Petosiris, mid 4th century BCE, that's getting us 500 years before the composition of the Corpus Hermeticum as we know it. So that just strikes me as like, when you can push a date back several hundred years. Now, am I going to call it Hermeticism? I probably wouldn't. I would call it proto-Hermeticism or whatever kind of, cautious academic ease you got to put in front of everything to make sure that you don't get torn to shreds and whatever. But the philosophy of the Corpus Hermeticum did not emerge in the Corpus Hermeticum. It emerged in oral conversations that occurred prior to that. The question is, where are those conversations happening, and what is the precursor literature or precursor oral traditions what are those? And I think I'm seeing them or hearing them on the columns and in the voice of these high priests of Thoth in the tomb of Petosiris. So I think that was quite a revelation, and it dispelled a lot of preconceived notions that I had. So that was a huge one. Yeah, also just learning that, that I knew this in an intellectual way, but I hadn't really thought about it as deep as I could have or should have, is just how much literature ancient Egypt produced. We're so used to just reading the funerary literature,
Mm.
but the Egyptians produced a lot of literature and technical literature that has nothing to do with funerary practices. And really coming to appreciate their non-funerary literature is a is an important thing. We really appreciate Israelite literature, right? No one ever talks about Israelite architecture because we don't have any of it hardly. No one go to Israel and how many Israelite buildings are there? No one, they didn't build any. I mean, they were just a minor civilization who the most spectacular thing they could have built would have been paltry compared to anything the Egyptians built. But we all know Israelite literature, right? The Bible, right? We know that literature. People quote that literature all day, every day without even knowing it. What we know about ancient Egypt is buildings. We don't know about their literature. And I think that's a complete travesty. It's a complete travesty that we don't know more about the fact that they wrote love poems and they wrote short stories and ghost stories and technical manuals on math and on medicine. And I want to go back to Egypt just to do a course on Egyptian literature. It's a literary trip.
Wow.
Of course, some of it will be esotericism, but it will be just a literary trip where we just read the literature of ancient Egypt as if the Book of the Dead or the Book Coming Forth by Day, just as if it doesn't even exist. Like intentionally to block off all the funerary literature and just read everything else that survived. I think that's that's a thing. So I think it was an opportunity for me to really get into the Egyptian literature that they produced that had nothing to do with the afterlife and the duat and that kind of stuff.
Well, it certainly sounds like it was an inspiring trip, and I mean, in several directions here. That's
Absolutely.
fantastic, man. So on that tack, I spoke to Dr. Puka recently, and she mentioned you guys might have something in the pipeline. If that's something that you want to talk about, of course, I want to give you an opportunity at this point to talk about anything you have that's forthcoming.
Yeah, I mean the Dr. Puka and I are Angela Puka of Angela's Symposium, which I would encourage everyone to support her work. Yeah, we're talking about maybe an Italy trip that would be Naples, Rome, Florence. Really, again, cross-cutting through time, Roman texts, Greek texts, because people forget that Naples is named Neapolis, the new city. It's a Greek colony, and so there's a huge connection. Pythagoras and those guys are in Italy. People forget that.
Parmenides too, in that area.
Yeah, in that area, that's absolutely right. And so it's really important to think of, we think of Greek philosophy, but we should think of southern Italy as being the Greek hinterland. And many of these big ideas were forged in the boot. And so so we could go from Pythagoras and Parmenides to Ficino and Lazzarelli. And I think that would be a cool, Bruno's Burned, of course. There's just lots of I don't have to belabor this point to you, Ike, or to your listeners. Italy obviously is if the cradle of Western esotericism in Egypt, then Italy is the swaddling clothes, to continue this metaphor. I don't know, but certainly it's a hugely important place in the development of all this, and so it'd be a real honor to be able to do educational work with Dr. Pucca, who of course she is Italian, to be able to do that work there in Italy, but. There's a lot of moving parts, as you well know, and we have to sort those out. But yeah, that's in the pipeline. We'll see where it goes. I think the next big thing that I'm working on is, last summer I did a seminar, I think 14-part seminar. Or actually ended up being more than that, on the philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. And I think this year the seminar, I'm going to start doing these yearly esoterica seminars, and they're going to be this year is going to be on Merkava mysticism. And so we're going to be taking a look at Merkava or Hechele mysticism, doing a pretty, again, deep dive. I don't want to say 14 episodes. I don't want to, don't want to put a cap on it. I don't want to tell myself I'm going to do that many. It's going to take what it's going to take. So this seminar this year is going to be on Merkava and Hechele mysticism. And of course, last year, what came out of the Agrippa seminar was Dr. Dana Trell and I worked on a completely new translation of hitherto untranslated works of Cornelius Agrippa, which was a real honor to work with Dan, and a real honor just to get Agrippa's voice out there. He's a voice that we all talk a big game about Agrippa, and yet we don't read the guy. And I'm just talking about the 3 books of occult philosophy, much less the stuff that's still in Latin. I was like, Dan, let's get it out there, man. Let's get these hermetic lectures out into the world so people can get their eyes on them. And it was a real honor to work with Dan, and a real honor to, again, to take a voice that I think matters, Cornelius Agrippa's voice, and to get his voice into as many people's ears as want to hear him. Because it's not fair that, people don't have Latin, people can't study this stuff in the original languages. And so it was a great, again, a great honor to do what I can to contribute to this whole field by taking Agrippa's voice and getting it out into the world of contemporary folks who are interested in Hermeticism or the sort of occult philosophy that Agrippa inspired. So yeah, that'll be the big thing is this Merkava mysticism seminar that's coming up at some point later this year. I'm not sure exactly when.
Awesome. I think we're both doing I think we're both talking at EnokiaCon too.
That's right.
That's going to be in July. Friday.
That's right.
Shout out.
Yep.
I'm looking forward to that. So,
are you going to be there? Are you going to be there in person?
I have another conference that I'm going to be at. I'm going to be at, and this is probably an announcement for whoever's listening to this at this point, but I'm going to be at Mystic South in Georgia. So, I'm going to, I'm gonna probably present from like my hotel room.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I would love to go though, and I know the big lead up right is Prague. So and it's so far it's been a really interesting and tight knit group of presenters and people that have surrounded the event. So if we end up going to Prague in a couple of years, I will definitely be there, and I hope I'll see you there.
Yeah, God willing. Yeah. They're doing that. Trying to think what else is coming up with Esoterica. It's funny, like I've just got back from Egypt. I was just in New York for the Antiquarian Book Fair. Got to see some truly incredible esoteric. Again, for anyone interested in old books and esotericism, you got to treat yourself one year to go to the New York Antiquarian Book Fair, where you get to handle a third printing of Malleus Maleficarum. I got to handle first printing of Molitor's De Lamiis. This is the first time an image of a witch is ever printed. And this is a $127,000 book, and it's just in my hands. And, it's only at the New York Antiquarian Book Fair where you can hold in your hand stuff that otherwise is basically only in museums. So I highly recommend for folks who love old books, interested in esotericism, you got to treat yourself one year to the New York Antiquarian Book Fair. Just the joke I tell is that if the Library of Heaven had a gift shop, it's the New York Antiquarian Book Fair.
Yeah. And if hell were a place on earth, it's New York. No, I'm just I can say that. I grew out of the ground there. So lived there, born and raised. So that's actually a really good spot to come to the canned question that everybody gets on the show for everything that we've spoken about this evening. Mostly, Egypt and that kind of stuff. Can you recommend 3 books to our listeners that you recommend strongly in terms of, getting a really solid orientation to, whether that's the history of Egypt, hermetic philosophy, anything really in that vein? 3 books.
3 books. I mean, I think that and I'll give books that are a little bit, maybe a little bit off the beaten path that I think folks should read if, because I imagine a lot of folks have read the Egyptian Hermes and Garth Fowden and stuff like that. So I would say that you should pick up the book called Conversations in the House of Life. This is the only Egyptian text written in Egyptian. It's Roman era Demotic text that's actually prepared by the priests of Thoth. So this is our only literary glimpse into the priesthood of Egypt, specifically the priesthood of Thoth, and into the actual Egyptian literature. So if you've never read it, it's very strange, but highly worth. It's called Conversations in the House of Life. So that'd be one. So the second text I would really recommend is a really fantastic book by Marina Escalano Poveda called The Egyptian Priests of the Greco-Roman Period. This is the most extensive treatment of the Egyptian priesthood during the Greco-Roman period. That's the period that gives us everything, all of everything from the Corpus Hermeticum to Plotinus, Ammonius Saccas. That is like the ground in which those stuff was developed. And her text is the most in-depth analysis that I've seen of the priesthood in ancient Egypt during that crucial period. So highly recommend her book. It's been a really fantastic text. In third, I think, for Egypt stuff that I would recommend, yeah, I guess I'll say is that if you read French, the third text I would recommend is, and if you're really interested in the origins of this Hermeticism and the Thoth cult, is take a look at the 1923-1924 analysis of the tomb of Petosiris. It's in French, so you'll need to be able to learn to read French. But he describes every aspect of the tomb, wall to wall. Every bit of the hieroglyphics is translated. There's commentary on everything. It's an amazing text. You can read it for free on archive.org. The whole thing is on archive.org for free. I'll send you a link, Ike, if you want to see it. And folks want to get an access to it. So again, this will be a text I'm going to be covering up, coming up soon on the channel. And it's just, I think, a glimpse into the tomb as text, but the tomb as text of a person that I think, if he didn't give rise to Hermeticism, he was certainly part of the world of the people that did. I think he probably was. I do think that he just ticks off all the boxes. And certainly he's a crucial figure in the way that the story remembers itself, by making Petosiris part of this astrological, astronomical, alchemical, magical literature. So I really recommend folks take a look at, it's just called The Tomb of Petosiris. It's just in French. I'll send you a link over, and you can put it in the show notes or whatever folks want to take a look at it. But awesome. Just a shocking tomb where you're seeing like clearly Greek winemaking imagery right next to giant scarabs and Anubis and stuff. It's just like, whoa, it's really sort of visual whiplash when you see it, because it's just like clearly Greek art right next to Egyptian hieroglyphics, and that just sounds like Hermeticism. If you know anything about Hermeticism, it's the visual cue that, hold on, there is some kind of synthesis happening here, and this is well worth taking note of.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Sledge, thank you so much for being with me and talking with me and telling me about your trip. It's always an honor and a pleasure to speak with you, man. And I'm very excited and I'm very grateful, as I'm sure many of us are, for the work that you continue to do for our communities. So thank you.
Thank you, Ike, and thank everyone for listening. And folks, Ike is going on a trip soon as well, taking folks to Egypt. And I really recommend that if you want to see Egypt with a person who really cares about the Western esoteric tradition like Ike does, I'd really recommend getting on boarded with his trip. Argos, the folks who are the same folks that did the logistics for my trip are doing the logistics for Ike's trip. They did an amazing job, and I'm sure that Ike's trip is going to be absolutely incredible. And so if you respect what I do out of Esoterica, just know that I'm endorsing Ike's trip, and really highly encourage folks listening to get on board. It would be an excellent opportunity to see Egypt in a really important way with a really thoughtful person like Ike leading the trip. I'm sure it'll be just incredible.
Thank you.